What should have been a routine trip home turned into a national controversy. When Dr. Maya Carter, a renowned civil rights attorney, arrived at JFK Airport, she expected to go through immigration like any other traveler. Instead, she was detained, questioned, and humiliated without cause. As white passengers passed through effortlessly, Maya was treated like a suspect in her own country. But what the officers didn't realize was who they had just stopped. What happened inside that interrogation room? How did a simple airport stop lead to policy reforms at the national level? Stay tuned for the full story. And before we dive in, make sure to subscribe so you never miss powerful stories like this. JFK International Airport buzzed, with the usual chaos, passengers rushing to gates, last-minute announcements crackling over the speakers, luggage wheels clattering against the tiled floor. Dr. Maya Carter adjusted the strap of her designer handbag as she stepped forward in line at immigration. She had been through this process 100 times before. Stamped in, stamped out, routine. But today, something felt different. The immigration officer, a white man in his late 40s, with a rigid posture and sharp eyes, barely glanced at her before flipping through her passport. The moment his gaze landed on her name, a flicker of something crossed his face. Doubt? Suspicion? Whatever it was, Maya recognized it immediately. A deep sigh built in her chest, but she held it back. She had seen this expression before. Too many times. He looked at her, his tone flat. "Step aside, ma'am. We need to verify your passport." Maya arched an eyebrow. "Is there a problem?" His jaw tightened. "Just routine." Routine. That word again. It was always routine when it happened to people like her, but never to the man in line before her, the one who had breezed through without so much as a second glance. Maya folded her arms. Routine for whom? The officer didn't answer. Instead, he turned and muttered something to a colleague. A second officer, a burly man with a closely shaved head, walked over, his expression unreadable. "Step to the side, please," he repeated. Maya glanced around. Other passengers were moving swiftly through the checkpoints, their passports stamped without hesitation. She was the only one being singled out. Her pulse quickened, but she forced a calm smile. "I'd like to understand why." The first officer tapped on his computer screen. "Your passport appears questionable." Maya exhaled slowly. "Questionable how?" Again, no answer. She clenched her jaw. "And what exactly about my official United States passport is questionable?" Still nothing. But the officers exchanged a quick glance, a silent confirmation that neither wanted to back down. Another sigh built in her chest, but this time, she let it out. "All right," she said, lifting her hands in surrender. "Let's do this." They led her to a small inspection area just beyond the immigration counters. A cold, metal table sat in the center. One chair. No windows. The air smelled of stale coffee and disinfectant. Maya placed her handbag on the table as the officers stood over her, their movements methodical, almost rehearsed. One of them slipped on latex gloves and began searching her bag. "What exactly are you looking for?" she asked, her voice level. The officer didn't look up. "Illegal substances, fraudulent documents, weapons." Maya scoffed. Because I fit the profile." His hands hesitated for just a second before continuing. She crossed her arms. "I'd like to speak to a supervisor." The second officer smirked. "We'll determine if that's necessary." Maya watched them carefully. They moved like this was just another day for them. Like humiliating people who looked like her was just part of the job. Then, one of them made a mistake. "I bet she's hiding something," the officer muttered under his breath. Maya's eyes snapped up. "What did you just say?" The officer's face turned pale. "Nothing." But it was too late. A few feet away, a passenger had been quietly recording everything on their phone. And soon, the world would see. Outside, the lines of passengers moved swiftly, oblivious to the unfolding drama. But one person had noticed. A white man in a gray blazer, standing just a few feet away, watched the scene unfold with growing anger. His own immigration check had taken less than 30 seconds, yet here was a woman being held back for no reason at all. His hands clenched into fists. "This is wrong," he muttered under his breath. And he wasn't the only one who thought so. A few feet away, a young woman, an airport employee, glanced nervously in Maya's direction. She had seen this happen before, far too many times. Maya, still seated in the inspection room, locked eyes with the officer frisking through her belongings. She leaned forward slightly, her tone measured but unmistakably firm. "You're making a mistake," she said. The officer smirked. "I doubt that." Maya held his gaze. "Then call your supervisor." A beat of silence. Then, reluctantly, the officer reached for his radio. Maya sat back. "Good," she thought. "Now let's see how far they're willing to take this." Because if they had done even a basic background check, they would have realized something critical. She wasn't just any traveler. And before the day was over, they were going to regret stopping her. Maya sat with her back straight, arms crossed, watching as the officer rifled through her belongings with deliberate slowness. The cold metal table between them reflected the harsh fluorescent lights above, giving the room an eerie sterility. Her passport lay in the center, untouched for several minutes now. They weren't verifying it. They were stalling. A second officer, taller, with a shaved head, leaned against the doorframe, arms folded. He wasn't searching through anything, just watching her, his expression unreadable. The latex-gloved officer finally pulled out her travel case, flipping it open with a smugness that suggested he expected to find something damning. Instead, he found what any other traveler might carry: a neatly packed makeup kit, a laptop, a few books, and a folder filled with professional documents. He paused at the sight of the folder and lifted it carefully, flipping through its contents. Maya let him. With each second that passed, her anger simmered just beneath the surface. Let them dig, she thought. Let them see who they're dealing with. The officer frowned as he skimmed the documents. "What are these?" Maya's lips twitched into a humorless smile. "Policy recommendations for the United Nations. I'm on my way back from a human rights conference." His fingers hesitated. He flipped to another page. "Interesting," he muttered, but there was irritation in his voice. He had expected something incriminating. Instead, he found evidence that he had just detained a prominent human rights advocate for no legitimate reason. Maya leaned forward slightly. "Is there a reason I'm being treated like a criminal?" The taller officer standing by the door snorted. "No one's treating you like a criminal, ma'am." She cocked an eyebrow. "Really? Because I'm the only person in this airport being interrogated over a perfectly legal passport." Silence. Then, the first officer spoke, his tone sharp. "Where did you say you were born?" Maya's fingers curled into her palms. She had already given them this information, but now they were playing that game. She exhaled through her nose. "Washington, D.C." A flicker of doubt passed between the two men. The first officer crossed his arms. "You sure about that?" Maya let out a dry, humorless chuckle. "Oh, my mistake. I must have forgotten my own birthplace. Want me to check my birth certificate for you?" He didn't appreciate the sarcasm. His jaw tightened. Outside, the airport continued its steady hum. Passengers chatting, luggage rolling, announcements blaring. But inside this room, time felt stretched. Deliberately so. And then, it happened. A voice from outside, loud, angry. "This is wrong." The door burst open slightly, and through the crack, Maya spotted the man in the gray blazer, the passenger who had been watching everything unfold. His face was flushed with frustration as he pointed toward the officers. "You're letting every white traveler through in seconds, but you've got her locked in a room like she's on a no-fly list? Are you serious?" The taller officer's posture stiffened. "Sir, this is none of your concern." "The hell it isn't," the man shot back. "I've been standing there for 20 minutes watching this happen. If this isn't racial profiling, what the hell is it? Maya felt the air shift. The officers exchanged glances, their previous confidence faltering. But before either of them could respond, another voice joined in. "She's right," a young woman said. Maya turned slightly. Standing outside, the room near the security desk, was a black female airport employee. Her ID badge gleamed under the harsh airport lights. She swallowed hard, as if debating whether she should speak. Then, finally, she stepped forward. "They do this all the time," she said, voice steady but laced with exhaustion. "They drag out security checks on black travelers longer than anyone else. Especially black women." A thick silence settled over the room. Maya's eyes locked onto the two officers, watching as the weight of the accusation settled over them. This wasn't just an isolated incident. It was a pattern, a system. The tall officer at the door cleared his throat. "We're just following protocol." The airport employee scoffed. "Whose protocol?" Maya saw it, then the tiniest flicker of doubt in the officer's eyes. A moment of hesitation, and she seized it. "I think it's time for a supervisor," she said. "Unless, of course, you'd rather keep this going?" She nodded slightly toward the man in the gray blazer, whose phone was now raised slightly. He wasn't just watching, he was recording. The officer with the latex gloves swallowed hard. "One moment." He turned sharply and exited the room. Maya didn't move, but inside, she felt the tide shifting. They had pushed too far, and now they weren't the only ones in control of this situation. As the door shut, she allowed herself a small, victorious smile. This was just getting started. Maya sat motionless, her hands folded neatly on the cold metal table. The air in the room felt heavier now, thick with unspoken tension. Outside, the low murmur of airport activity continued, but inside these walls, everything had come to a standstill. The officer who had been rifling through her things had left, presumably to fetch a supervisor. But the taller one, the one who had been leaning against the doorframe, arms crossed, remained. He watched her, his expression unreadable. Maya met his gaze evenly, refusing to be the first to look away. She could feel the weight of history pressing down on this moment, on every second she spent in this room. This wasn't just about her. It was about all the others before her, the ones who had been humiliated, detained, degraded, and never given a voice. She wasn't going to let them reduce her to another statistic. Finally, the officer cleared his throat. "You travel often?" Maya tilted her head slightly, not missing the attempt at small talk. "I do." "Must be nice," he said, shifting his stance. "Going all over the world like that." Maya could hear it, the subtle undertone in his voice. The disbelief. The assumption that someone like her didn't belong in boardrooms, didn't belong in first-class lounges, didn't belong in the circles of power she walked in daily. She let a small smile touch her lips, but there was no warmth behind it. "It is." He didn't like that answer. His fingers twitched slightly at his side, his posture stiffening. He wanted a reaction, wanted her to get angry, to raise her voice, to give him a reason to justify what they were doing. She wouldn't give him the satisfaction. The door swung open abruptly, breaking the standoff. A new officer entered, a man in his 50s, with graying hair and a more authoritative presence. Maya assumed he was the supervisor. His expression was tight, already set in irritation before he had even looked at her. "What's going on here?" he asked, his voice clipped. The tall officer straightened. "We needed to verify her documents." The supervisor's eyes flicked toward Maya. He picked up her passport from the table and scanned it. Maya studied him carefully. Would he be different? Or would he double down? After a long pause, the supervisor exhaled sharply and set the passport down. "Looks fine to me." Maya raised an eyebrow. "Does that mean I'm free to go?" The tall officer hesitated. He glanced at his superior, as if searching for an escape, a way to justify prolonging this even further. And then, in a moment that Maya would never forget, he made a fatal mistake. She claimed she was born in Washington, D.C., he said, his tone laced with skepticism. We have no way of confirming that. Maya's spine straightened. The supervisor frowned. You checked the database? The officer nodded stiffly. There were inconsistencies. Maya let out a slow, measured breath. Inconsistencies. That was a word they used when they wanted an excuse. A word that carried no real weight but could be used to justify keeping her here longer. The supervisor seemed to consider this, his lips pressing into a thin line. Maya's patience was at its limit. She leaned forward, her voice calm but cutting. You're lying. Both men froze. Maya tilted her head. You checked the database and everything was fine. But now that I'm pushing back, you're grasping at straws. You want to keep me here, but you don't have a reason. So, you're making one up. The tall officer's face darkened. Ma'am, I suggest you lower your tone or what? Maya interrupted, her eyes locked onto his. Silence. Then, she smiled slow, deliberate. Let me tell you what's about to happen, she said, her voice like steel wrapped in silk. You're going to let me go. You're going to stamp my passport, and I'm going to walk out of here. Because if you don't, that recording, she gestured toward the glass window, where the man in the gray blazer was still holding up his phone, recording everything, is going to hit the internet in less than 5 minutes. And something tells me neither of you wants to be trending under racial profiling at JFK. The supervisor stiffened. He glanced toward the window, his jaw clenching. He knew. He understood the weight of this. For the first time since she stepped into this room, Maya saw hesitation in their eyes. The moment stretched between them, thick with unspoken consequences. Then, without a word, the supervisor picked up her passport, flipped through it, and stamped it. He slid it across the table toward her. Maya didn't move immediately. She let the silence sit for a moment longer, let them feel the weight of what they had done. Then, with the same poise she had walked in with, she reached forward and took her passport. She stood, adjusting the strap of her handbag. Before turning away, she met the tall officer's gaze one last time. Next time, she said quietly, don't assume that because I'm black I don't belong. She turned and walked toward the door, her steps slow, deliberate. And behind her, for the first time, they had nothing to say. Maya stepped out of the interrogation room with the same poise she had walked in with. Her grip tightened around her passport, but her expression remained unreadable. She could feel the eyes on her, the officers, the passengers, the airport staff. Some watched with quiet curiosity, others with open disdain. But one thing was certain. They all knew something had just happened. As she walked back toward the main immigration hall, the man in the gray blazer fell into step beside her. He exhaled sharply, shaking his head. That was unbelievable. Maya glanced at him. Is it? His expression faltered. I mean, it shouldn't be, but I just saw it happen. She offered a tight smile, but there was no humor behind it. Now, imagine experiencing it your whole life. The man swallowed hard, shame flickering across his face. Before either of them could say more, a sharp voice cut through the air. Excuse me, ma'am. Maya stopped, turning to see a different immigration officer, an older man with graying hair and a more polished presence, walking toward her. His suit was better pressed, his ID badge marked with a higher rank. A supervisor. Her patience had already worn thin, but she remained composed. Yes. He hesitated for just a fraction of a second before clearing his throat. Would you mind coming with me? Just for a moment. Maya felt her stomach clench. She had just walked out of a wrongful detainment. Was this going to be round 2? She took a slow breath. Is there a problem? The supervisor's gaze flicked to the officers in the background, the ones who had detained her. His lips thinned. Then, turning back to her, he shook his head. No, ma'am, he said carefully. But I believe there's been a mistake. Maya exchanged a glance with the man in the gray blazer, who now looked thoroughly confused. Still she followed. The office she was led into was nothing like the cold, metal room she had just left. This one had carpeting, framed certificates on the walls, and a leather chair instead of a bolted-down metal one. The supervisor gestured for her to sit, but Maya remained standing. "I'd rather get to the point," she said coolly. The man hesitated again. Why did they always hesitate right before everything unraveled? He walked around his desk, opened a file, and ran a hand over his face before finally speaking. "Dr. Carter," he said carefully. The simple acknowledgement of her title made her eyebrow arch. He looked up at her. "You're a guest of the White House, aren't you?" Silence. Maya didn't react immediately, but she felt the shift in energy, the way his voice softened, the way he suddenly realized who she was. She exhaled slowly, controlled. "I am." His face tightened. She could see it now, the calculation. He was running through every decision that had led to this moment, realizing the enormity of their mistake. Maya let the silence stretch, let him sit in his discomfort. Then, finally, she broke it. "Let me guess," she said, voice smooth as glass. "You ran my name after I left, didn't you?" The supervisor swallowed hard. "Yes, ma'am." And a pause. Then, reluctantly, he admitted, "You have diplomatic clearance." Maya nodded once. "That's correct." Another silence. Maya leaned forward slightly, letting her voice drop just enough to make him uneasy. "So tell me, sir," she said, her tone razor-sharp, "what exactly do you think the White House will say when they find out their guest was just racially profiled and detained at JFK? The color drained from his face. He began but stopped. There was no justification, no excuse he could offer that would undo what had already happened. Maya's lips curled into a tight smile. "That's what I thought." The air in the room was suffocating now. Finally, the supervisor straightened his posture, taking a slow breath. "Dr. Carter, I sincerely apologize for the mistake." Maya tilted her head. "Which mistake? The one where your officers detained me for existing? Or the one where you realized I had power, and now you're scrambling to cover it up?" He flinched. Another beat of silence. Then, carefully, he slid a business card across the desk. "I'd like to personally ensure that nothing like this ever happens again. If there's anything I can do—" Maya let out a short laugh, not bothering to pick up the card. "You can start by fixing the system. I won't be the last black traveler who walks through your airport." She turned on her heel, heading for the door. But just as she reached for the handle, the supervisor spoke again. "There will be consequences for this," he said. His voice was quiet, but there was something different in it now. A grim certainty. Maya paused but didn't turn around. "For whom?" "For them," the supervisor admitted. "The officers who detained you." Maya exhaled through her nose. "It's a start." And with that, she stepped out of the office, back into the world that was already watching. The airport terminal buzzed with life as Maya stepped back into the main hall, her heels clicking against the polished floor. She inhaled deeply, feeling the weight of what had just transpired settle in her chest. They knew. The moment they ran her name, the moment they saw who she was, everything changed. She had seen it before. The shift. When a person goes from being a nobody in their eyes to someone they should have never crossed. The realization that they had messed with the wrong black woman. But it wasn't just about her. It was about everyone before her and everyone after. The ones who wouldn't have their names recognized. The ones who wouldn't have the privilege of a diplomatic connection to protect them. And now the world was about to find out. As she walked, a commotion near the immigration counters caught her attention. A group of people had gathered, passengers whispering, airport staff glancing nervously at their supervisors. But it wasn't the usual airport chaos. Something was happening. She followed their gazes. And then she saw it. A video was playing on a passenger's phone, her video. No, not hers. Theirs. The recording taken by the man in the gray blazer. The one who had witnessed everything. The one who had refused to stay silent. The screen showed her sitting in that cold metal room, the officers looming over her. The audio was muffled, but clear enough. We have no way of confirming that. Let me tell you what's about to happen. Because if you don't, that recording, Maya's own voice rang through the terminal, cutting through the chatter like a blade. The people gathered around the phone were shaking their heads, murmuring in outrage. A young woman standing nearby turned and saw her. Her eyes widened. It's her. Within seconds, heads turned in Maya's direction. Passengers who had ignored her before were now paying attention. Some held up their phones, capturing the moment. The energy in the air shifted from quiet curiosity to something heavier. Recognition, validation, anger. Maya didn't stop walking. She wasn't going to perform for them, but she also wasn't going to run. She kept her head high, her posture straight. If they were going to watch her, she would let them see exactly who she was. A voice called out from the crowd. Dr. Carter. Maya turned. A journalist identified. Only by the camera slung around her neck and the press badge clipped to her jacket was pushing through the onlookers. Dr. Carter, she repeated, slightly breathless. Would you be willing to comment on what happened? Maya tilted her head slightly. You've seen the video. What do you think happened? The journalist hesitated, choosing her words carefully. It looks like racial profiling. Maya let the silence stretch before responding. It doesn't look like racial profiling, she said. It was racial profiling. A murmur spread through the crowd. The journalist nodded. Are you planning to take legal action? Maya exhaled slowly, choosing her words wisely. What happened to me today happens to black travelers all the time. The difference is, most don't have a recording. Most don't have the resources to fight back. If legal action will bring real change, then yes, I'll consider it. The journalist pressed on. Do you think the officers involved should be fired? Maya studied her carefully. She knew how the media worked. They wanted a soundbite, a headline that would go viral. She gave them something better. I think they should ask themselves why they felt so comfortable treating me that way, Maya said evenly. Because firing a few officers won't fix a broken system. The journalist opened her mouth to ask another question, but before she could, another voice cut in. We're sorry, Dr. Carter. Maya turned. Standing a few feet away was the senior immigration supervisor, the same one who had called her into his office moments ago. But now, his voice carried a different weight. Not just authority, but something else. Something heavier. Shame. Maya crossed her arms. Are you? He hesitated. He glanced at the passengers watching, the phones recording. He knew there was no escape from this moment. Yes, we are. Maya tilted her head. Who's we? The supervisor's lips pressed into a thin line. The officers involved are being placed under review. This will be investigated. A sharp laugh escaped Maya's lips before she could stop it. Investigated, she echoed. That's convenient. The man flinched. Tell me something, she interrupted. If my name hadn't been flagged in your system as a White House guest, would I still be sitting in that cold room right now? Silence. A few passengers in the crowd muttered under their breath. They knew the answer. Maya let out a slow exhale. That's what I thought. She turned back to the journalist. Here's your headline, she said. Today, the world saw what black travelers deal with every day. The only reason I'm standing here right now answering your questions is because someone was watching. Her eyes flicked to the supervisor. I wonder how many others weren't so lucky. The man swallowed hard, but he had no answer. Maya nodded to herself. Then, without another word, she turned and walked away. She had a flight to catch, and an entire world that was about to listen. Maya kept walking, her posture straight, her expression unreadable. But inside, she could feel it, the shift. The moment had passed, but the impact was only beginning. As she reached her gate, she pulled out her phone. The screen lit up with notifications, texts, emails, missed calls. Her name was already trending. Justice for Maya Carter, racial profiling at JFK, flying while black. The video was everywhere. News outlets had picked it up. Influential voices were amplifying it. And the comment sections? They were on fire. This is infuriating. How many times does this have to happen before real change? They let a white businessman walk through in 2 seconds, but treated a black woman like a criminal for no reason. She's literally a human rights lawyer. The irony is painful. This happens to us all the time. The only difference is she had people watching. Maya closed her eyes briefly, pressing the bridge of her nose. She had spent years advocating for justice, exposing systemic racism in legal policies, fighting for those whose voices were ignored. And now, she had become the case study. She opened her eyes again, scanning her texts. One name caught her attention: Talia Jackson, her best friend, a journalist, and one of the most relentless reporters when it came to civil rights violations. Talia, Maya, call me. Now. Maya exhaled and hit the call button. Talia picked up instantly. Tell me you're suing, was the first thing out of her mouth. Maya smirked despite herself. Nice to hear your voice too. Maya, Talia pressed her voice tight. This is big. It's not just trending, it's exploding. CNN just played the video. The NAACP released a statement. People are calling for an investigation. Maya's fingers drummed against her thigh. And what do you think I should do? Talia scoffed. I think you should own this moment. You've been fighting this fight for years, and now you have the entire world watching. Use it. Maya sighed. I didn't want to be the story, Talia. I wanted to change the story. You still can, Talia said, softer now. But you know how this works. They're going to try to sweep it under the rug. They'll call it a misunderstanding, a training issue. Maybe fire a couple of low-level officers to make it go away. Maya clenched her jaw. She knew Talia was right. And that's when she made her decision. I want a press conference, she said. Talia inhaled sharply. Are you sure? Yes, Maya said firmly. Set it up. Talia didn't hesitate. Consider it done. As Maya ended the call, she realized her flight had started boarding. She took one last look at her notifications before slipping her phone into her bag. She wasn't done yet. Not even close. The conference room was packed. Camera flashes, reporters murmuring, microphones adjusted. The energy was electric. Maya sat at the long table in front of them, calm, composed, yet commanding. She had been in this position before, answering questions about discrimination, systemic failures, human rights violations. But this time, she was the headline. Talia sat beside her, ready to field the reporters. But the moment the floor opened for questions, chaos erupted. Dr. Carter, do you believe this was an isolated incident or part of a larger pattern? Maya's gaze was steady. It's a pattern, one that has existed for decades. I was lucky I had cameras, I had witnesses. But most black travelers don't. And if I, with my credentials and connections, can be treated this way, imagine what happens to those without power. Another journalist jumped. And what do you say to those defending the officers, claiming they were just following protocol? Maya let out a dry chuckle. Protocol? Does that protocol involve questioning someone's birthplace when they have a valid U.S. passport? Does it involve detaining someone without evidence, without reason, while letting others walk through without issue? A murmur of agreement rippled through the crowd. A third journalist raised a hand. Are you planning to take legal action? Maya leaned forward slightly. This was the moment. I am calling for a full-scale federal investigation into racial profiling at U.S. airports, she said, her voice clear, unwavering. This isn't about me. This is about justice for every black traveler who has been treated like a suspect simply for existing. The room erupted. Flashbulbs. Shouting. The rapid click of keyboards. Maya sat back, letting the moment settle. She wasn't playing defense anymore. She was leading the charge. Inside a dimly lit office, the senior immigration supervisor sat at his desk, watching the press conference on his screen. His fingers steepled beneath his chin. A knock on the door. A junior officer stepped in, looking nervous. "Sir, there's an issue." The supervisor exhaled. "What now?" The officer hesitated. "The DHS just called. They're launching a formal investigation. They want names. They want records. They want everything." A long silence stretched between them. The supervisor pinched the bridge of his nose. This was bigger than he had feared. And in the pit of his stomach, he knew heads were going to roll. 2 days had passed since Maya's press conference, and the ripple effects were undeniable. The Department of Homeland Security, DHS, had formally announced an investigation into racial profiling at U.S. airports. The story had spread beyond national news. International outlets were covering it. Civil rights organizations were speaking out, and social media was a battleground of heated debates. But Maya wasn't focused on the noise. She was preparing for the next step. Sitting in a quiet office in downtown Washington, D.C., she scrolled through her emails. Legal teams, advocacy groups, government officials, everyone wanted a statement, a meeting, an endorsement. Her phone vibrated. A familiar name flashed on the screen. Unknown caller, government line. Maya answered. "Dr. Carter speaking." A measured, professional voice came through. "Dr. Carter, this is Assistant Secretary Daniel Mercer from the Department of Homeland Security. We'd like to request a meeting regarding your case." Maya leaned back in her chair. "My case? Or the case of racial profiling at JFK?" A slight pause. "Both." Maya smirked. They were taking this seriously. "Name the time and place," she said. Back in New York, inside a stark windowless room, the 3 officers who had detained Maya Carter sat. In silence. Their supervisor, the same one who had tried to cover up the mistake, stood near the door, arms crossed. Across from them, 2 DHS investigators, 1 man. 1 woman sat with open files in front of them. The female investigator, Agent Patel, tapped her pen against the table. "Let's go over this one more time. You detained Dr. Carter because..." The first officer, the one who had rifled through Maya's belongings, with barely concealed disdain, shifted uncomfortably. Her passport raised concerns. Agent Patel raised an eyebrow. "What concerns?" A pause. Then, weakly, he said, "It didn't seem authentic." Agent Patel leaned forward. "Did you verify it?" Silence. She tapped the file in front of her. "Because according to the system logs, her passport was scanned and cleared immediately." The tall officer, the one who had questioned Maya's birthplace, cleared his throat. We needed to be sure." The male investigator, Agent Roberts, folded his hands. "Needed to be sure of what exactly?" Another beat of silence. Then, Agent Patel pulled out a tablet and set it on the table. She hit play. Maya's recorded interrogation filled the room. "Are you sure about that? You're making a mistake. Let me tell you what's about to happen." The officers visibly tensed. They hadn't realized just how much had been caught on camera. When the recording ended, Agent Patel studied them carefully. "So, tell me again, why was she detained?" The room was thick with tension. Finally, their supervisor sighed, rubbing his temple. "Look, this got out of hand. Maybe we were a little aggressive, but we were just doing our jobs." Agent Roberts leaned back, unimpressed. "Your job, huh?" He flipped through the file and pulled out another document. "You know what this is?" The officers glanced at the paper, but didn't respond. "It's a pattern analysis of security detainments over the last 12 months at JFK, he explained. "It shows that black travelers are detained at a rate 4 times higher than white travelers." The officers shifted in their seats. Agent Patel continued. "And do you know how many of those detainments led to actual legal action?" Silence. She held up the document. "Less than 1%. No one spoke. The weight of those numbers, the undeniable proof of bias, hung in the air. Finally, Agent Roberts set down his pen. "We're going to recommend disciplinary action." The tall officer stiffened. "Wait, What kind of disciplinary action? Agent Patel didn't blink. At minimum, suspensions. Possibly terminations. The first officer's face paled. Terminations. The supervisor, sensing the situation slipping further out of his control, leaned forward. Hold on, let's not jump to extremes. Surely, we can discuss. Agent Roberts cut him off. We're past discussion. He let that sink in before delivering the final blow. The DHS is recommending a full-scale policy review of racial profiling at airports nationwide. And just like that, their world began to crumble. Maya entered the DHS conference room with the same measured confidence she had displayed at the press conference. She wasn't here to be polite. She was here to hold them accountable. Across the table sat Assistant Secretary Daniel Mercer, a man in his early 50s, with a tired but sharp gaze. He gestured for her to sit. Dr. Carter, thank you for coming. Maya sat, folding her hands on the table. Let's not waste time, Mr. Mercer. What is DHS prepared to do? Mercer exhaled. We are launching a nationwide audit of TSA and CBP procedures regarding racial profiling. Maya didn't react. And Mercer hesitated. And we're willing to work with you on policy recommendations. Maya tilted her head. Policy recommendations? Yes, Mercer said. We want to fix this, but we need guidance from experts in the field. Maya studied him. Was this just damage control? Or did they actually want to make a difference? She decided to push. I want mandatory anti-bias training for all immigration and security officers. Mercer nodded. Done. I want quarterly reports made public on racial disparities in detainments. Another nod. We can make that happen. Maya didn't flinch. I want officers held accountable, not just trained, but terminated if they abuse their power. Mercer exhaled, rubbing his temple. That will require more discussion. Maya leaned forward. Then start discussing. A long silence. Then Mercer nodded. All right. Maya sat back. She had won this round, but the fight wasn't over. It was just beginning. The air inside the Department of Homeland Security conference room was thick with tension. Maya sat still, her face impassive. But inside, she was analyzing every word, every hesitation, every carefully measured response from Assistant Secretary Mercer. They were willing to audit their system. They were willing to discuss policy changes. But what Maya wanted, real, enforceable accountability, was still up for negotiation. She had seen this play out before. Governments were good at sounding like they wanted change, at making promises wrapped in vague language that allowed them to delay action indefinitely. She wasn't about to let that happen. Mercer exhaled, rubbing his temple. Dr. Carter, I understand your frustration. Maya's eyes flicked toward him. Do you? He hesitated. I understand that this was an unacceptable situation, Mercer corrected himself. And I understand that public pressure is high. We need to move carefully. Maya leaned forward slightly. No, you don't. Mercer blinked. Excuse me? You don't need time to decide whether systemic racism at airports is a problem, Maya said coolly. You already have the data. You already know the truth. The only question is whether you're willing to do something about it. Mercer's lips pressed into a thin line. Across the table, one of his aides shifted uncomfortably. She had them, but she needed to push harder. Maya tapped the file in front of her. I'm not just here to suggest changes, Mr. Mercer. I'm here to demand them. The room was silent. Then, slowly, Mercer sat back in his chair. He studied her for a long moment before speaking. You're not going to let this go, are you? Maya's voice was firm. Not a chance. A long silence stretched between them. Then Mercer finally nodded. All right, he said. Let's talk real solutions. Maya's chest tightened slightly. This was it. The moment everything could shift. She reached into her bag and pulled out a neatly organized proposal. Here's what needs to happen. Back in New York, the walls were closing in on the officers involved in Maya's wrongful detainment. Inside the immigration office, the three men sat across from their union representative as official termination notices were placed in front of them. "You can't be serious," the tall officer, the one who had questioned Maya's birthplace, hissed. "They're actually firing us?" The union rep, an older man with graying hair, sighed. "They don't have a choice." The video went viral. DHS is cracking down. They need someone to blame. The first officer's hands balled into fists. "So, we're the scapegoats?" The rep didn't answer, because they all knew the truth. They weren't scapegoats. They had done exactly what the system allowed them to do until, for once, it backfired. The third officer, the quietest of the group, finally spoke. She wasn't just some random traveler. The other two turned toward him. "She was powerful," he continued. "We didn't know who she was." The tall officer scoffed. "And if she wasn't?" No one answered. Because they knew. If Maya Carter hadn't been a high-profile figure, if she hadn't had a witness recording everything, if the video hadn't spread like wildfire, nothing would have changed. The union rep cleared his throat. "They're going to make an example out of you. My advice? Take the severance, sign the NDAs, and move on." The room fell silent. Because, for the first time, the officers realized they weren't the ones in control anymore. Maya sat in a high-rise office with Talia, sipping a cup of coffee as they watched the news unfold. A CNN anchor spoke over footage of the DHS press conference. In response to public outcry and growing evidence of racial profiling at airports, the Department of Homeland Security has announced new mandatory anti-bias training for all TSA and CBP officers, as well as quarterly reports on racial disparities in detainments. Maya leaned back. "It was a start." Talia smirked. "Not bad, Carter." Maya raised an eyebrow. "Not enough either." Talia set down her coffee. "What's next?" Maya exhaled, looking out at the city skyline. "Accountability," she said simply. Talia tilted her head. "You already got some of them fired." Maya shook her head. "That's not real accountability. That's damage control." Talia's smirk faded. "So, what do you have in mind?" Maya's fingers drummed against her knee. "I'm going to push for an independent oversight board, a separate entity that reviews airport security misconduct." Talia whistled low. "That's ambitious." Maya smiled slightly. "So was getting DHS to admit this was a problem." Talia chuckled. "Fair point." Maya turned back to the TV, where a political analyst was discussing the broader implications of the case. "This is a historic moment. It's the first time a single case has forced this level of scrutiny on airport policies nationwide. But the real question is, will this be a one-time reform, or will it lead to permanent change?" Maya took a slow sip of her coffee. Permanent change. That was exactly what she was going to fight for, and she had no intention of stopping now. Inside a government office in Washington, a high-ranking official watched the same press conference. His phone rang. "Yes," he answered, his voice clipped. The voice on the other end was cautious. "Sir, we have a situation. Dr. Carter isn't stopping. She's pushing for an oversight board." A long pause. Then, the official let out a slow breath. "Keep an eye on her." "Should we intervene?" A beat of silence. Then, "No. Let's see how far she takes this first." Maya sat in a sleek, glass-walled office in downtown Washington, D.C., her fingers resting lightly on the armrest of her chair. Across from her sat three senior government officials, one from the Department of Homeland Security, one from the Transportation Security Administration, and one from the White House's Office of Public Engagement. None of them looked particularly thrilled to be here. She had forced this meeting. After DHS announced its new policies in response to her case, Maya had immediately pushed for more. A few firings and an anti-bias training program were nowhere near enough. She wanted an independent oversight board. She wanted real accountability, and that had made certain people very uncomfortable. The man from DHS, a heavy-set bureaucrat with graying hair, cleared his throat. Dr. Carter, first of all, let me say that we appreciate your advocacy on this issue. Maya held up a hand. Let's not waste time with pleasantries. The man blinked, slightly thrown off. The TSA representative, a thin woman in a navy suit, pursed her lips. Maya leaned forward. I want an independent oversight board that reviews all security-related misconduct at airports. I want the data made public. And I want officers who abuse their power to be held accountable not just internally, but in a court of law. The room fell silent. The White House official, a younger man in his late 30s, dressed in an expensive suit, finally spoke. Dr. Carter, you have to understand the difficulty of implementing something like this. Maya arched an eyebrow. Difficult for who? The man hesitated. For the agencies involved. We already have internal review processes. Maya let out a short, sharp laugh. The same internal review processes that let this happen in the first place? The TSA official's jaw tightened. We are addressing that. Not fast enough, Maya countered. DHS shifted in his seat. You're asking for a level of transparency that could create public distrust in our security operations. Maya's expression turned cold. Public distrust? You created that when you let racial profiling run unchecked. This isn't about making people feel better. It's about fixing the problem. The White House official exhaled. Dr. Carter, we need to be strategic. If we move too aggressively, we could face serious pushback from law enforcement unions, security agencies, even members of Congress. Maya's patience snapped. Pushback? She repeated, voice sharp. Do you think black travelers don't face pushback every single day? Do you think I care about how difficult this is for the bureaucrats who allowed it to happen? Silence. She leaned back, tapping her fingers against the table. The world is watching. You know that, right? The DHS official exchanged a glance with the TSA rep. Maya smiled thinly. Got them. This isn't going away, she continued. You can either be remembered as the administration that took action or the one that let a national scandal explode. The White House official sighed, rubbing his temple. What exactly do you want? Maya didn't hesitate. An independent oversight board, she said again, voice firm. Not run by TSA, not run by DHS. Completely separate. With subpoena power and regular reports to Congress and the public. DHS shook his head. It's happening, Maya cut in. The only question is whether you want to be dragged into it kicking and screaming, or whether you want to be the ones who get credit for making it happen. More silence. Then slowly, the White House official exhaled. We'll consider it. Maya tilted her head. That's a politician's way of saying no. The man smirked, despite himself. We'll seriously consider it. She studied him for a moment, then nodded. Good. Because I'm not backing down. The meeting ended, but Maya knew one thing for certain. This fight wasn't over. Inside a high-level government office, a very different meeting was taking place. A senior intelligence officer stood in front of a large screen displaying Maya Carter's name, her picture, her credentials. She's not stopping, he said, voice clipped. And she's gaining traction. Across from him sat a man in a dark suit, his fingers steepled. A higher-ranking official. Someone with real power. Do we have anything on her? The suited man asked. The intelligence officer hesitated. Nothing that would discredit her. The suited man let out a long, slow breath. That's a problem. The officer shifted. What's our move? The suited man's eyes darkened. Keep watching her. Maya was exhausted. The fight had barely begun, but she already felt the weight of it pressing down on her. She sat on her couch, staring at her phone. Texts from colleagues. Missed calls from journalists. Emails piling up. Then one message stood out. Unknown number. Be careful who you push, Dr. Carter. Maya's stomach clenched. She stared at the text for a long moment, then calmly set the phone down. She had expected this. Resistance always came when real change was on the horizon. But if they thought a veiled threat was going to stop her, they had no idea who they were dealing with. Maya stared at the message on her phone, her heartbeat steady but deliberate. Unknown number. Be careful who you push, Dr. Carter. She had spent years exposing corruption, challenging broken systems, and holding the powerful accountable. She knew what this was. A warning. A veiled attempt at intimidation. But intimidation only worked on people who were afraid. And Maya Carter was not afraid. She took a slow breath, her mind racing through possibilities. The text was vague, no direct threat, no specifics, but the message was clear. Someone wanted her to stop. She placed her phone on the coffee table, leaned back into her couch, and let the silence settle. The question wasn't if she should continue. It was how she would respond. And then she made her decision. She picked up her phone again and dialed. Talia answered on the first ring. Tell me you're calling to say you're running for office. Maya huffed a short laugh. Not yet. Talia's tone shifted, hearing the weight behind Maya's voice. What happened? Maya hesitated, then said, I got a message. Talia was silent for a second. Then, her voice sharpened. A threat? More of a warning. From who? No idea, Maya. Admitted. But that's the problem, isn't it? Talia exhaled. They're scared. Good, Maya said, because they should be. Another beat of silence. Then, Talia's voice softened. What's your next move? Maya leaned forward, rubbing her temple. I'm making this bigger. Talia's breath caught. Bigger how? Maya's mind was already working through the logistics. A rally. A national movement. If they want me to stop, I'll make sure they can't ignore me. Talia let out a low whistle. Damn, Carter. You never play small. Maya smiled. Never. The airport's atmosphere had changed. The officers at immigration moved with visible tension, the weight of the DHS investigation pressing down on them. The 3 officers responsible for detaining Maya Carter were gone, fired, publicly disgraced. But the problem wasn't just 3 officers. It was the system that had allowed them to act unchecked. And now that system was under a microscope. Passengers were filming more interactions with security. Civil rights lawyers had set up hotlines for complaints. Journalists were digging into years of racial profiling data. The fear wasn't just on one side anymore. Now, the people in power were the ones looking over their shoulders. 3 weeks later, Maya stood on a massive stage in front of thousands. The crowd stretched across the Washington Mall, a sea of people holding signs, chanting for change. This wasn't just about her anymore. It was about every black traveler who had ever been targeted, detained, or humiliated for no reason other than their skin color. She gripped the microphone, scanning the crowd. They were ready. She took a breath and spoke. This started with me, but it's never been just about me. A roar of agreement. This is about every single person who has been stopped, searched, questioned, and treated as a suspect simply for existing. More cheers. Signs waved. For too long, we've been told to accept it, to keep our heads down, to not make trouble. She paused, her voice steady. Well, I am here today to say, we are done staying silent. The crowd erupted. Maya's voice rang out unwavering. We are demanding an independent oversight board to investigate racial profiling at airports. We are demanding that the people who abuse their power are held accountable, not just with suspensions, not just with apologies, but with real consequences. Applause thundered. We are not asking anymore, Maya continued, her voice rising. We are telling them change is coming, whether they like it or not. The roar of the crowd was deafening. Maya stepped back, letting the energy wash over her. This was no longer just a movement. It was a revolution. And there was no stopping it now. Inside a secure White House meeting room, the DHS officials, TSA leadership, and senior government advisors sat in silence. The president's chief of staff leaned forward, rubbing his temple. "This has gotten out of control," he muttered. The White House official from Maya's earlier meeting cleared his throat. "She's not backing down." "No," the chief of staff said grimly. "And now neither can we." The DHS official shifted. "So what do we do?" The chief of staff exhaled, then said the words none of them wanted to say. "We give her what she wants." Silence. Then slow nods around the table. The Independent Oversight Board was about to become reality. Maya sat at her desk when the email came through. Subject: Final decision. Independent Oversight Board approved. She exhaled slowly, reading it twice just to be sure. They had agreed. It wasn't everything. It wasn't justice for every past injustice. But it was a start. And Maya Carter was just getting started. She picked up her phone and called Talia. "It's happening," she said. Talia's voice was a mix of pride and disbelief. "Maya, you just changed history." Maya leaned back, a small smile touching her lips. "No," she corrected. "We did." Months later, the new Oversight Board was officially launched. Complaints against airport security skyrocketed, but this time, they weren't ignored. Officers were investigated. Some lost their jobs. Some faced legal action. The message was clear. The rules had changed. And Maya Carter? She became the name that every airport official remembered. Because she hadn't just challenged the system. She had forced it to change. Maya Carter's fight wasn't just about her, it was about all of us. No one should be judged, detained, or mistreated because of their race. Her story proves that when we stand up, speak out, and refuse to back down, real change is possible. But the fight isn't over. What do you think? Have you ever experienced discrimination while traveling? Where in the world are you watching from? Drop a comment below. We want to hear your voice. And if you want more powerful stories like this, hit that subscribe button and turn on notifications so you never miss an update.